Amen. Well, welcome, and it is a privilege to be here with you. It is always a privilege, and Pastor honors me by giving opportunity to preach from time to time. I'm not as polished as I once was at preaching on Sunday mornings, so I'm going to knock a little bit of rust off this morning and ask that you bear with me. And it's a great privilege to be here. As I said, it's always good to get to be here before you. And if you have your Bibles or you have your electronic device that you use, go ahead and start turning forward towards 1 Kings chapter 19 is where we're going to be at this morning. We're following along with the lectionary. Now, there's an alternate Old Testament passages that goes along. Pastor's been preaching out of the book of Genesis, but the alternate to that is in 1 Kings, and that's where we're going to be today, because I can never pass up an opportunity to preach about one of my favorite characters from the Bible in general and my favorite from the Old Testament. So I'll just tell you that last night I was in the shower talking to Sarah. Well, we weren't in the shower together, She was sitting there, on the toilet talking to me while I was taking a shower, because Christians would never shower together. Never mind. But anyway, I was in the shower and I asked her, honey, what's the opposite of joy? And she thought about that a long second and she said, well, I guess the opposite of joy would be sadness. And I said, okay, then what's the opposite of peace? And she said, well, I guess that would be discord or turmoil. I said, yes, honey, that's absolutely a great answer. That's an excellent answer. What's the opposite of depression? Well, the opposite of depression would be elation. And then I asked her, so then what's the opposite of woe? And she thought about that for a minute. Said, well, wouldn't that be what we've already talked about? I said, no, the opposite of woe is giddy up. So I say that, corny pastor joke, to tell you this. I've got my cowboy boots on this morning, so let's giddy up. Now, cowboy boots are guaranteed to make me preach twice as better and half as long-winded. So fortunately for y'all, I've got them on today. Before we get into 1 Kings 19, I will share with you from the book of James over in the New Testament, chapter 5, verse 17. James said this. He said, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. So we say that about this great man here from the Old Testament, Elijah, that James tells us and is testifying in the New Testament about what a great prophet of the Lord he was, that he prayed and it didn't rain for 3.5 years. And yet today, what I'm talking to you about is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and a subject that's probably very sensitive for many of you. And we're going to be talking about depression in the life of a man of God. So Elijah, and we're going to get more into his story. I'll give you some more backstory in a minute. But Elijah had one of these greatest victories we read about in the whole biblical narrative up on a place called Mount Carmel. And he had just seen God work in this amazing way, and he had seen his enemies literally burned up before him. And then he fell into this very dark place. So in the Old Testament, at the time of Elijah, there was a very wicked king, and his name was Ahab. In fact, there's a reason we don't name kids Ahab today. And he had an even more wicked wife who was named Jezebel. So please don't name your children Ahab or Jezebel. But in the book of 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1, it says, Ahab, this wicked king, he told Jezebel, his wicked wife, all that Elijah had done, and now he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel steps in and takes over now. Her husband's whining about how his plans have fallen through. And so in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 2, she says, Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, meaning one of her prophets, by this time tomorrow. Then he, Elijah, was afraid, and he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. So when we read this, it's very confusing when we think back to all that God has done through Elijah's life. And then since I haven't had the opportunity to preach for several weeks before this on Elijah, I'll just give you a little recap. So what was going on is that the people of Israel, their hearts had turned from God, and they'd been led astray by this wicked king Ahab, who had led the nation into worship of Baal and Asherah. And so Elijah is sent by God Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe is sent by God to stand before evil King Ahab, and he goes before Ahab and he pronounces this word from the Lord: there is going to be a drought. There will not be any rain until I say otherwise. And then from there, Elijah leaves from Ahab and he goes and he hides in this place called the Kiriath Ravine. And the Kiriath Ravine, we could translate as the grief ravine, the ravine of mourning. And he hides there for 3 years. And in this time while he's there, and there's a drought in all the land, and there's no rain, and there's no running water hardly, ravens are sent by God to bring bread and meat to Elijah. And not only that, but there's this little brook in the valley where Elijah gets all the water he needs to drink for 3 years. After 3 years' time, that little brook dries up, and Elijah leaves, and he goes to a place called Zarephath. And he walks in Zarephath, and there's this woman, and she has a son, and Elijah's led to her, and he tells her, go in and make me a little bread so that I'll have something to eat. And she says, but I've only got a little flour and a little oil. I was about to make something for my son and I. We were going to eat it and then die. And Elijah just says, well, you go bake me some bread first, and then you go ahead and bake some for your son. And this miraculous miracle takes place where the little bit of flour and the little bit of oil does not run out. For the rest of the drought, they're sustained by this small amount of flour and small amount of oil that she has. And then one day, while Elijah's there, the woman's son, he up and dies. And God, through Elijah, raises her son back to life, and he's fine. And then from there, God calls God calls Elijah to go have this great showdown with Ahab and the prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel. And all the prophets can't get their gods to come and to burn up their sacrifices. But Elijah prays one simple prayer, and fire comes down from heaven and burns up the sacrifice and burns up the altar. And everyone sees the power of God on display. And then an even more amazing thing happens. Elijah prays 7 times for rain. He sends his servant out to look, and over the ocean he sees a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. And Elijah says, get ready, the storm's coming. One little cloud, and Elijah knows through faith the storm is coming, the drought's over. And there becomes a great rain, and it's so powerful that Elijah's running down the mountains, and the chariots that all the king and the queen and everybody are riding get mired down in the muck and can't get down the road. Amazing and miraculous protection we see all through Elijah's journey as a prophet. All through the story of Elijah, we see these amazing miracles take place. And then one wicked woman says, I'm going to kill you, and he loses it, and he panics, and he runs for his life. So today, we're going to talk about 4 easy ways to get depressed. 1 Kings 19, verse 3 through 5. He arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life. For I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down. You ever feel like that? You ever just want to say, God, just take away my life. God, I'm done. Just come and get me. Step number 1 on how we get depressed, you do what Elijah did. Wear yourself out. Wear yourself just plumb out. If you'll ever notice, over these past few years, Elijah had been on this massive spiritual battle where God had been doing all these things, but then he runs for his life and he ran as far as he could. Literally, he ran as far as he could. If you look at a map, Elijah ran as far as he could south to get away. He was totally physically and spiritually exhausted. Probably much like many of you. Just worn out. You've been going, and you've been giving all that you have to give. And you may wonder why you're depressed, and it just might be because you've worn yourself out. Well, you're working a full-time job, and you're taking care of the house, and you're putting dinner on the table, and you're carting kids all over the world and making sure they've got what they need, and you're going and buying clothes and school supplies, and you're involved in the PTA, and you're involved at church, and you're doing all the things that are asked of you, and you wonder why you're so frazzled, and some of you wonder, why am I so depressed? And you're wearing yourself out, and some of you, it's not just physical, but it's all up here. That's where it happens to me. It's in my head. Well, I got to be there for them. I have to be a provider. And you've totally worn yourself out. Step one, wear yourself out. Step two, shut people out. We see that's exactly what Elijah did. Elijah abandoned his closest friend. He told his servant, you stay here, and then he separated and isolated himself from me. Quite honestly, that's what many of us do when we get overwhelmed. It's the same thing that I do. Well, you wouldn't understand anyway. So we wall up and we withdraw. You know, sad to say that's what I do. When I'm worn out and I'm hurting, I put the wall up. I don't want to talk to people. I don't want to see people. I don't want to be around people. You know, and I have this conversation with some of my soldiers all the time for my job as a chaplain, that I tell them this directly. I say, when you get to feeling this way, and when you feel like you don't want to be around anyone, when you want to shut everyone else, that is a sure sign that you need to be around people right now. That you need to be around the right people too, who are going to encourage you as well. But instead we want to shut people out. Step two, we shut people out. Step three, we begin to focus on the negative. Anybody else guilty of that? Focus on the negative. This is exactly what our hero, Elijah, the man of God, that's what he did. He said, I've had enough. I've had enough. And the self-pity began to take over. And you know the funny thing about self-pity? You know what self-pity does? It exaggerates. It exaggerates everything. It's all of the bad things and none of the good things. It's everything is as bad as it can possibly be. It's the worst case scenario. It's hopeless from here. Self-pity. We focus on the negative. And then step four, finally, we forget about God. Imagine all that Elijah had seen God do. Imagine all that we see God do in the life of Elijah through this story. From the drought to the ravine to the widow's house to the showdown on Mount Carmel. And yet here we see Elijah, oh God, you won't come through for me now. Perhaps you said the same thing. God's not going to come through this time. That's what we so often do, isn't it? You know, I can look back and I need a calculator to add up all the times that God has been faithful and come through for me. I look back and see that He's never failed me. But in that moment of depression, that moment of despair, we forget about the faithfulness of God. He's not going to come through this time. How to get depressed in 4 easy steps. Wear yourself out. Shut people out. Focus on the negative and forget God. So now that we talked about that, let's talk about the answer. And for many of you today, this may be the reason that you are here. This may be what you need to hear from God. Maybe God is speaking directly to you today. Maybe you're blue, or maybe you're just full-blown depressed today, and maybe you're in a place of hopelessness. But the good news is that God wants to speak to you through the life of Elijah. What we find here in the Scripture is God's prescription for our depression. Now, I do want to interject a little note here. There are such a thing as chemical imbalances. I highly encourage you, as I would highly encourage any of my soldiers that's dealing with major depression and anxiety, go see your doctor. Please. That is not unspiritual. That is not exhibiting a lack of faith. Go see your doctor and tell them what's going on. But what we see here is the prescription God has for Elijah for our depression. Elijah, he had no home. He'd been hiding out. He was wanting to die. And in the moment while he's laid down under this tree, just wishing his life would end, God sends an angel. So notice what the angel does not do here. There's no sermon from the angel here we're going to see. There's no rebuke. There's no shaming Elijah for, Elijah, how can you behave this way? Shame on you. No, there's none of that. The angel does not say, if you only had more faith. Instead, in 1 Kings 19, verse 5 and 6, it says, and he lay down to sleep under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank and he lay down again. Part one of God's prescription, God says to eat and rest. But I've got to do this, or maybe I've got to do this for God. And there's all kinds of spiritual reasons not to rest, but some of you, the most spiritual thing you could do right now is to rest. One of my favorite memes on Facebook, I love it every time it comes around, said, never forget that one time when Elijah was worn out and burned out, that God told him, here's something to eat, now take a nap. Never underestimate the spiritual value of a nap and a snack. Some of you this afternoon, that's probably what you need, is a nap and a snack. One of the most disobeyed commands of God is to rest. You see, in that list of 10 commandments that God gave, there's one of them in there that says specifically about keeping the Sabbath. And Sabbath doesn't mean you better go to church every Sunday. Now, you should come to church when there is church, absolutely. But that's not what it's about. Sabbath is about rest. The Sabbath is not a suggestion. Some of you need to get this today. You need to hear this deep into your soul. Sabbath is not a suggestion. It's a commandment. You are commanded to rest. That's an order. It's not about what day of the week it is. It's not about if you go to church on Saturday or Sunday or if you go on Wednesday night. It's about rest. And so many shake it off like it's nothing. Well, that sounds like a great idea, but you have no idea how much I have to do. And I'm going to tell you this, when you decide to start practicing Sabbath in your life, last semester, I had a really tough seminary last semester, and I was working every spare moment. When I was at work, when I wasn't on call, I probably shouldn't say this in front of Captain Bowers over here, but when I was at work and I wasn't on call, I was working on seminary in that patrol car. I don't know who's seeing this today. Listen, when I would get home from work, typically 10 or 11 at night, I would generally go to my office and work a couple more hours. When I would get up in the morning, I was doing schoolwork until I went back to work. On my days off, I was generally writing papers for 7 or 8 hours a day. And I was burned out. And I finally came to the conclusion, because it was funny, I was in a class that I was doing all that work for, and part of the class was about Sabbath. And I decided, I've got to. I am killing myself. And it was funny, one week I just decided, tomorrow's my day off. I don't care if I get an F. I'm not doing anything. And I sent my professors emails and I said, I'm not going to have this turned in tomorrow. And you know what they said? Okay, no problem. And I sat there and did nothing all day, and it was wonderful. Some of you, you've got to get this today if nothing else. God has commanded you to rest. 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 I believe God would say right now, it doesn't matter if the clothes are dirty. It doesn't matter if the sink's full of dishes. It doesn't matter if the house is a wreck. It doesn't matter if the dog's covered in mud. It doesn't matter if the children are covered in mud. It doesn't matter if a few things are undone. You need to rest. Back in 1 Kings 19, verse 7 now, it says, And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat. The journey will be too great for you. And he arose, and he ate, and he drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, Horeb we read about here, and scholars generally agree, Horeb was the mount where Moses met with God and where he was given the commandments. Eat, rest, and spend time in God's presence. Eat, rest, and spend time in God's presence. I told him, go to the place where the presence of God is and spend time there. Some of you need to eat, rest, and don't forget this, when you're feeling depressed, you might not want to, but the place you need to come is you need to come to church. And you'd be amazed what it does to be in the presence of the people of God. Because guess what? We're all just as messed up as you are. And we need it too. Eat, rest, and let's come together and be in the presence of God and allow God to minister to his people. Go to the place where God is. Part 2 of God's prescription for depression. God replaces our lies with his truth. our lies with his truth. 1 Kings 19, verse 9 through 10. And there he came to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. That's a true statement. For the people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant. That's also a true statement. They have thrown down thy altars. Yeah, that's a true statement. And slain thy prophets with the sword. Absolutely true. And then he says, and I, even I only, am left. False. And they seek my life to take it away. You see, what God wanted was for Elijah to verbalize his problems. And you know, it's amazing, and I'm not saying that everybody needs to be in therapy, but probably 99% of you need to be in therapy, and the other 1%, you're in denial about your need of therapy. But I'm just kidding. But we need to talk to people sometimes, because it's amazing what happens when you actually start to verbalize what you're feeling. Put into words what you're feeling. God wanted Elijah to verbalize to God his problems. He said, I'm the only one left. False. I'm doing all the work. False. I'm the only one who can get it done. False. He owned more responsibility than was actually his. And so many of us were probably doing the same thing. If you read on, God goes on to say, Elijah, there's 7,000 others who have not bowed down to the false gods. Don't believe the lies, Elijah. Don't believe the lies, church. What God would say to so many others today when we believe the lies. Well, my marriage can never be healed. It's doomed. That's a lie. Well, with God, all things are possible. We replace the lies with His truth. Well, my kids will never come back to Christ and live lives pleasing to Christ. That's a lie. Why is that impossible for God? With a faith as small as a mustard seed, God can move mountains. So many of us believe the lies. Well, my life will never be any better. I will never have an intimate, loving relationship. I will be alone the rest of my life. I will always be stuck in this dead-end job. I will never have any kind of ministry that has any impact. I will never make a difference in my family's life, in my coworkers' lives, or in my community. God takes those lies and replaces it with truth. Some of you, if I were to ask you, you might speak a lie today. You might say, I was talking about the topic of depression. If you've ever been depressed, you understand. You'd be willing to say, I'm always going to be depressed. I'm always going to feel exactly like I do right now. I cannot tell you how many soldiers I counsel every month that tell me similar statements. I can't see that things are ever going to get any better. I just want to die. Every month. Every month. Part 3 of God's description for depression. And this is where the story takes a turn. It says, God speaks in a still, small voice. Remember how Elijah is used to meeting with God. You know, this is the God who made the drought. This is the God who fed him by ravens carrying in meat and bread every day. This is the God who made the oil and the flour last and last and last. This is the God who raises the dead to life. This was the God who sent down fire and burned up the sacrifice. And this is the God who sent a downpour after 3.5 years. All these big, amazing things. And he's very electing God to show out again and do something great here. But in 1 Kings 19, 11, and 12, it says, and he said, go forth and stand upon the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains. You know what that means? That's an old word. It means it tore the mountains. And it broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. You know, sometimes when we're at the lowest, God seems to speak the softest. I know there are many of you that are here that are hurting. You know, you come in, you put on the face. We're good at it. Those of us that have been in church our whole lives, we're good at it. We put on the face, but you're hurting. Don't take my word for it. I'm just a man, but God wants to speak to you. If you listen closely enough, you may just hear that small, still voice. That voice of God that says, I'm here. I'm with you. You're not alone. I can handle this. My grace is still sufficient. Part 4 of God's prescription for depression. God gives us something to do. 1 Kings 19, verse 14, it says, He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thy altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel Meloha, I get tongue-tied there, you shall anoint him to be prophet in your place. You know, all these things that God just told Elijah to go and do, that's the stuff that prophets do. That's the everyday job of the prophet, is to go and do these things. And so what did God tell Elijah in this moment, in that small voice? He said, go back and do what prophets do. I believe that the Spirit of God would say to so many of you today, there is still something for you to do. You're not done. What is it? If you're a mom, go back to doing what moms do. If you're a businessman, go back to doing what businessmen do. If you're an attorney, go back to doing what attorneys do. If you're a cop, go back to doing what cops do. In this day and age, that's hard. If you're a teacher, go back to doing what teachers do and watch as He brings life back out of you. Watch as God brings you back to life and life flows from you. Notice He gave Elijah a gift too here, a great gift. He gave Elijah someone to believe in him. He told him to go into, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. Elijah, the man of God. And he takes Elisha along. He comes along beside him, and together they do what prophets do. And Elisha tells Elijah that whatever he has, he wants a double portion. And think about this. You know what was Elijah's greatest fear at the beginning of this story? Well, Jezebel threatened that she was going to kill him. Guess what he never experienced? Elijah's one of only 2 people in the Bible who never experienced death. The reality is, for many of you, not all of you, but many of you, the number one thing that is consuming you right now, the number one thing you're most worried about, you will never experience it because God will lift you above it. Now, we do have trouble in this world. Even if our greatest what if does come to pass, guess what? He promises He'll be with you and that you won't go through it alone. I don't know about you, but I find comfort in this story. Because, here, thousands of years later, we read the stories of Elijah and we read about, wow, what a great man of God he was. And we read about these great miracles that took place. But at the time, Elijah, who was human just like us, was struggling just like us. And I'm just like that. I'll experience great victory and I'll see God come through in an amazing way and provide in an amazing way. And then I'm on the bottom again. And in that moment, when it seems like things will never be any better, that's when God says, eat and rest and be in my presence. Stop believing the lies. Listen to my voice and go and do the things that I've called you to do.